Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Zachary Strong, and I am a physicist, psychology researcher, and biblical scholar. And today we are going to be answering a very interesting question, which is, where has all the magic and miracles gone? Where's all the magic? Where's all the miracles? Because if you're a biblical person and you read the Bible, you will encounter stories about all sorts of miracles. For example, in the book of Exodus, Moses and Aaron go to Pharaoh and they say, "Let our people go." And their staff turns into a snake, and Pharaoh's sorcerers do the staff snake thing. And then there's all sorts of miracles and so on. And you might be wondering, where have all these things gone? Why are we not performing miracles today? Where is all the magic? Right? Where is all the magic? And this is something that I've actually been pondering in various forms for a while. And in my journey throughout biblical literature and indigenous thought, I finally pieced together an answer. And so what I'm going to do today is give you both a biblical and an indigenous perspective on where all the magic and miracles have gone, and why our world seems to be so mundane. So in order to answer the question about where magic and miracles have gone, we have to take two elements of biblical metaphysics that seem unrelated, and then we have to combine them and follow that rabbit hole down to see where we end up. And where we'll end up is an answer about, magic and miracles in our world and in the past. So the first element of biblical metaphysics is the concept of sparks, or nitzotes. So the concept of a spark is kind of like collecting coins and rings and gems in a video game. So if you think about Sonic the Hedgehog, you're running through the map collecting rings. If you think of Mario, you run through the map and you collect coins and so on. And that's kind of like the concept of a biblical spark, which is an element of Kabbalistic thought. So essentially, when Adam and Eve ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, the universe kind of shattered in a way, and all sorts of sparks were released. And it's the job of human beings to go out into the world and collect those spiritual sparks. Now, they're invisible to us, right? It's not like we're walking around collecting visible coins and gems and so on. The sparks are invisible, but we're collecting them through our life experiences and so on. So we're collecting these sparks. Now, the second element of biblical thought is the concept of the klipa. Now, klipa literally translates to something like shell or husk, and essentially it is the veil of physicality that our universe produces. Okay, so God is not immediately apparent in our universe, and that's because there's this shell or layer of physicality that obscures God. And the reason that exists is, another rabbit hole. But so there's this veil of physicality, okay? And in Kabbalistic thought, in biblical metaphysics, the sparks that were released, at the beginning of the universe, they fell into the klipa. They fell into physicality. And so it's our job as physical incarnations of souls to go into the physical world, live our lives, do things, etc., and reclaim those sparks. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. I just dropped some high-level Kabbalah on you, but essentially, we're in a form of a video game where we incarnate as souls, we go through the world, we live our lives, and we collect these sparks that were released at the beginning of the universe, and we're kind of reclaiming the universe in a way. Okay, so now, you might be wondering, what does that stuff have to do with magic and miracles? And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to share with you a teaching from Duties of the Heart, which is a work of Jewish ethics. And this is something that I was pondering for a while, and then I came across this teaching, and I realized that I was onto something. So what I'm going to read to you is from a chapter on abstinence and ascetic practices. Things like fasting and secluding yourself in the desert and so on. This is a chapter that talks about those things. The difference between our ancients and ourselves in regard to abstinence is as follows. The ancients had pure minds and weak inclinations, and their souls followed the dictates of their minds. A small number of precepts sufficed in order for them to serve God perfectly. They were not in need of the abstinence that departs from the balanced way prescribed by the Torah. When their descendants went down to Egypt and lived there 70 years in peace, their desires became strong, their passion increased, and their physical instincts prevailed over their reason. Hence, they required a form of abstinence that would be the antithesis of their desire and that would counter their physical instincts. So, what this is talking about is essentially a descent from the spiritual into the physical. And in biblical metaphysics, that is actually what's happened in our world. Back in the biblical Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve were very, very spiritual. They had incredible spiritual perceptions and prophetic ability and so on. They perceived different layers of reality. But as time went on, as the generations progressed, things moved from a more spiritual existence to a more physical existence. So we're kind of descending from spiritual to physical. And you might be wondering, why? Why? What's the whole idea here? Now, we're going to combine that with what I've discussed previously. This gets kind of complicated, I guess. But if you think about, how we're going through our lives, collecting sparks, reclaiming spiritual things from physicality, from the physical world, what we're actually looking at is a progression of sparks that are buried in the klipa at a shallow level versus sparks that are buried in the klipa at a very deep level. And so in our world, we have technology, we seem to understand the physical universe, we don't really see magic or miracles anywhere. And part of that is because we are now, as a species, descending deeper and deeper into the klipa to reclaim deeper and deeper sparks. So in some ways, to use a video game analogy, the ancient peoples who operated in a very spiritual way, and they inhabited a more spiritual world, they were reclaiming sparks at a shallower level. And then our generations, with our technology and our science and all of these things, we're now so deep in the klipa that miracles and magic, at least obvious miracles, don't seem to happen. And that's actually a function of how deep we are in physicality. And so that's as far as I can tell why magic and miracles don't seem to exist right now, is because we're just at a certain level of the video game where we are so enmeshed in the physical world, in physicality, that these things are either inaccessible to us in terms of magic, or so hidden that we can't perceive them in terms of miracles. So really, what I'm trying to say, I suppose, is that the journey of the human species, from a biblical standpoint, has been to dive into the klipa, the physical world, and reclaim all of these sparks. And we've been going deeper and deeper and deeper as the generations went on. And now, we seem to be in a magicless, miraculous world. Now, interestingly, miracles still happen. Miracles still happen. But you have to be able to look for them. You have to be able to perceive them. And I've had miracles happen in my life, like several small miracles. No miracle is small, but I've had several kind of like small miracles happen over the last few months alone. And that's because I spend a lot of time doing biblical study, and I'm able to attune spiritually to these things. And it's a challenge to do that. It's a challenge to do that. It takes a lot of reading and contemplation and meditation and prayer. It takes a lot of effort to be able to do that. But it's still possible to kind of perceive the miraculous in our mundane world. Now, in terms of biblical thought, part of the challenge of our generation is to be able to do what I just described, which is to see through the veil of physicality that's set up by our universe, to see through the illusion, to see through the concealment, and to recognize that we live in a divine spiritual world, and that we are divine spiritual beings having a physical experience. That's part of the challenge. And for people that can do that, to the extent that they are able to do that, and they refine themselves into the kind of people that can perceive those things and live that way, it's kind of like a reward in the video game. You know? Because in video games, when you collect rings and gems and coins or whatever, it increases your score. And so our generation has a unique opportunity to see through the illusions, perceive the divine in the physical, and, you know, essentially gain points or reward for it. And it's interesting. I find it really interesting because when I look through biblical literature, there is I guess you could say a form of poem known as Perek Shira. And I featured that poem in my book, Sacred Treasures. And I've got a link to the text of the poem for free in the description. But essentially, Perek Shira was written about 2,000 years ago in more spiritual times. And the rabbis and sages that compiled this document were able to tell us what the wind was saying, what the sky was saying, what the trees were saying. And they linked all sorts of living creatures and natural forces to certain verses in the Bible. So for example, like the lightning is saying something. The pomegranate has its own verse in the Bible. Birds, a lot of time is spent on birds and what various birds are saying. Sheep, you know, when we hear a sheep say ba, but what a sheep is actually saying is a biblical verse. And even the fox, you know how like there's that song, What Does the Fox Say? Perek Shira will tell you what the fox says. And so this was compiled during a time when people had more spiritual capability and they were able to perceive more. And so Perek Shira is kind of like a legacy that was left to us so we can understand what the natural world is saying, you know, from a biblical perspective. Now, interestingly, indigenous thought also contains themes very much like what I just discussed from a biblical perspective. The indigenous peoples of the world, and particularly in my area, you know, it's the traditional land of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe. And if you talk to the indigenous peoples in Canada, America, you know, Australia, elsewhere, they will tell you that, yes, like the deer that we hunt, they have spirits and we need to honor them. The trees that we pluck fruit from, they have spirits and we need to respect those things. And that is actually completely in line with biblical metaphysics. And essentially, indigenous peoples, they carry memories of these more spiritual times. They carry memories of the times and the kind of world that's described by the Bible. And a lot of their beliefs and teachings reflect those things. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to end off this video by sharing with you just some elements of Indigenous thought. One of them comes directly from an Indigenous poet named John Trudell, and the other comes from a Disney film which features Indigenous themes, which I'm sure Indigenous people have conflicted feelings about it, but it's Disney, it's well known, and so I think it's worth highlighting that these kinds of thoughts and these kinds of teachings can be found everywhere, even in the mainstream. So the first thing I'm going to share is a poem by John Trudell, which is called A Lie Nation. The hallucination, the human beings. The people see the spiritual and the natural through sense and feeling. Everything is related. All the things of earth and in the sky have spirit. Everything is sacred. Confronted by the Ally Nation, the subjects and the citizens see the material religions through trauma and numb. Nothing is related. All the things of the earth and in the sky have energy to be exploited, even themselves, mining their spirits into souls, sold, into nothing is sacred, not even their self. The Ally Nation, the alienation. So that's one aspect of Indigenous thought. And these kinds of thoughts have become mainstream, in Disney films like Pocahontas. And so I'm going to share with you a song from Pocahontas which talks about these exact things. And it's called Colors of the Wind. And so I think, I haven't actually seen Pocahontas, but I did some research on the song. And this, Pocahontas is singing this to the, colonizers, settlers. So this is what she says. You think I'm an ignorant savage, and you've been so many places. I guess it must be so. But still I cannot see if the savage one is me. How could there be so much that you don't know? You think you own whatever land you land on. The earth is just a dead thing you can claim. But I know every rock and tree and creature has a life, has a spirit, has a name. You think the only people who are the people who look and think like you. But if you walk the footsteps of a stranger, you learn things you never knew. Have you ever heard the wolf cry to the blue corn moon? Or ask the grinning bobcat why he grinned? Can you sing with all the voices of the mountain? Can you paint with all the colors of the wind? Come run the hidden pine trails of the forest. Come taste the sun-sweet berries of the earth. Come roll in all the riches around you, and for once never wonder what they're worth. The rainstorm and the river are my brothers. The heron and the otter are my friends. And we are all connected to each other, in a circle, in a hoop that never ends. How high does the sycamore grow? If you cut it down, then you'll never know. And you'll never hear the wolf cry to the blue corn moon. For whether we are white or copper-skinned, we need to sing with all the voices of the mountain. We need to paint with all the colors of the wind. You can own the earth and still, all you'll own is earth, until you can paint with all the colors of the wind. And so these kinds of Indigenous perspectives are entirely conciliant with what is expressed in biblical metaphysics. Okay, we're spiritual beings trapped in physical bodies. We're having a physical experience. Our job is to see through the illusion, to not get lost in the physical, and to reclaim the spiritual heritage that we used to have many thousands of years ago. And so if you're wondering, where is magic? Where are miracles? They happen all around you. They happen all around you. And your job is to be able to perceive them and appreciate them for what they are.